Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to Mac and Chat. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. First of all, I hope everybody is having a wonderful kickoff to the Passover and Easter holiday. It's been a while since we've done one of these, and I couldn't think. I mean, these are two foodie holidays, if there ever were one or two, between the meatballs and the matzo balls. A lot of good eating going on. So what better way than with the lady that we're going to salute and celebrate tonight with a very special guest. Also, just want to wish a very quick happy heavenly birthday to one of my favorite divas, Betty Davis. She would have been 115 2 days ago. So wherever you are, Betty, we love you. And here's the thing about Betty. For those of you who know me, and there's absolutely no reason why you should know me, my name is Peter Mack, and I've spent the last 20 years paying tribute to the late, great Judy Garland, who I sing and speak live as well as a host of other Hollywood and Broadway goddesses. But I've always had this attraction to people with very unique voices, and the lady that we're going to talk about tonight certainly falls into that category. I was probably about 6 or 7 when I discovered her. Shortly after, I would say viewing an episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. PBS was a great babysitter back in the 80s, and it still is now. But our special guest tonight knew this lady very, very intimately. They not only worked together, but they became very good friends. So would you please welcome Julia Child's once executive assistant, Miss Stephanie Hersh. Hello.
Hello,
Thank you for joining us all the way from New Zealand.
my pleasure.
And is it afternoon over there, right?
It's 3 o'clock on Saturday,
Oh,
afternoon on Saturday. Yeah,
so
we're in bed.
way ahead of us, way ahead of us.
A lot of winning numbers.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Now, again, as I just mentioned, I discovered her on PBS. Well, like a lot of kids, I'm sure, who were watching PBS and Sesame Street. And I was saying this before we started the actual chat, was that she was so engaging because she really was a character. I mean, she had such a unique voice. She was so tall. She was so gregarious, but she was also so warm. I think that's the thing that drew me into her. You felt like she was talking directly to you. She had this way about her. Did you feel the same way?
Absolutely. And also, she was infectiously passionate about food and cooking. And so, even if you didn't cook, you still enjoyed watching her shows because of just her enthusiasm pulled you in. So yeah, she was amazing.
Absolutely. When did you discover her exactly? I'm curious. When did you get?
Well, we didn't watch much television when I was a kid. I did get to watch her occasionally when I visited my grandmother. We would watch Julia, and then we would watch Graham Kerr, the Galloping Gourmet,
Right.
and we would decide which recipe we liked better. And then my grandfather would go pick up those groceries, and Grammy and I would cook. So I certainly watched Julia then. But when I was in elementary school, and I think probably fifth or sixth grade, I used to babysit for the lady across the street, and she um, would very often have dinner parties where she would have me come and play with the kids and put them to bed, and then she would let me help her serve and clear her dinners. And over time, she taught me all sorts of things because in our household where I grew up, pretty much mac and cheese or pizza were dinner. um, that was interspersed between cereal and hot fudge sundaes, which was also quite nice. But at Dr. and Mrs. Silver's house, they ate very elegant food, and there I was learning to prepare it. And at one point, she said to me, "Would you like to cook the food? Would you like to cater my next dinner party?" And I, of course, said yes. And so she told me what she wanted me to make, and I wrote it all down. And I went home all excited and said, "Mom, I'm going to cook this, but I don't know what it is." And it was boeuf bourguignon and a salad vinaigrette and a chocolate mousse. And my
Wow.
mother said, I have no idea what any of that stuff is, but it's probably in this book. And she handed me Julia Child's cookbook. And lo and behold, all of that stuff was in there. The funny thing is that when I made the boeuf bourguignon, and I remember starting it on the stovetop and then it needed to go into the oven, and I wasn't tall enough to put it into our wall oven. So mom put it in, and then we set the timer and it came out and we tasted it. And I thought I was just so disappointed in the lady that I used to babysit for. I said, Mom, she's having beef stew. I told Julia that story many, many years later, and she thought that was very funny. So, yeah.
And it's one of the, well, and we'll talk more about Julie and Julia later, but that was like one of the recipes, the boeuf bourguignon.
Exactly, exactly. So I went to culinary. I went to college, then I went to culinary school. And when I graduated, I moved to Boston and worked in several hotel kitchens. And then I decided I wanted to see food in another part of the country, but I didn't really know how to get there. I didn't have enough money to pick up and go, and I didn't think I had enough clout to say to an employer, pay for me to move. And food in the 1980s was very regional in the US. So I didn't care where I went. I wanted to see Tex Mex. I wanted to see California cuisine. I wanted to see Southern cuisine. I knew the New York metropolitan area. And now I felt I had known the New England area, but I wanted to go see something else. So I thought, how do I get from Boston to anywhere else? I'll get a job in corporate America, work for a year, year and a half, whatever it takes until they'll pay for me to move, to transfer me. And then I'll quit the job and work in restaurants wherever they move me to. This was my so the
Why not?
problem with the plan was that in the 1980s you couldn't get a job in corporate America if you didn't know how to use a computer, and I didn't know how to use a computer. So I enrolled myself in the Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School. They had a 3 month entree program, which was meant for career changers. And I lined up a job with a big banking firm. Everything was falling exactly into place. And the day before I graduated, Julia Child called the school looking for a secretary with a culinary background.
Wow.
And the placement office lady said to me, in the history of the school, you're the only person with that background. Can we send your resume to her? Well, duh. So, yeah, so the rest is sort of history. I actually, Julia didn't, after seeing my resume, she didn't want to hire me because I didn't have any secretarial experience, and she wanted somebody that was going to come and work in the offices, not someone that wanted to get into the kitchens. And I talked her into giving me a trial run, which she did, and then the rest is history. I stayed, and of course I got into the kitchens almost right away. So yeah, that was all. um yeah, it was a dream job.
What were your first impressions of her? Were you intimidated by her? Was she? I'm just curious what those first maybe couple of weeks or what was the impression?
It's interesting. Actually, I spent when the placement office told me that Julia wasn't going to hire me, I asked them why, and they said they didn't know. And I said, well, could you call her and ask? And they said, no, they wouldn't. And after a round and round we went, I finally got them to dial the phone and hand it to me. And
Wow.
Julia answered the phone herself. And I had about a 45-minute conversation with her on the phone with the placement office ladies staring at me. Um, and we talked about what the instructors were like that I had at the college because she knew all of them. We talked about what the regional cuisine in the U.S. was like, and she was, wanted to know my take on that. She wanted to know what it was like behind the scenes in Boston because she knew all those chefs that I worked with, but she wanted the gossip. She wanted the behind the curtain. But interspersed between all of these conversations, I had to keep repeating back to her, I understand I won't be cooking. I know that I won't be in the kitchen. There is no food involved with this. It's just in the office. And I must have said that 75 times in the 45 minutes that we were on the phone. And she finally, as I said, agreed to give me a trial run. So when I showed up the next morning with this huge knot in my stomach, not because I was going to work for Julie, but because I had never been a secretary before, and as I rang the doorbell, it was total mayhem. I mean, it was just craziness. And I rang the doorbell, and Julia Child came down the 5 steps and opened the door herself. You must be Stephanie, she said.
That's great.
And I said, "Yeah, that's who I am." And she said that she forgot that they were filming a day in the life of Julia Child for Canadian Public Television, and that she was meant to make herself some lunch on camera. And she handed me 5 Xerox pages from The Way to Cook, which was the newest book that had come out. She said, "Follow me." We walked up the 5 steps. She pointed to her right, which was the kitchen. She said, "Please get it ready." And then she turned to her left and they started filming. So I couldn't ask questions or anything, but the knot in my stomach disappeared. Cooking, I know how to do that. And so basically, I read through the recipe. I didn't know if she wanted it just measured. Did she want it cooked in stages? Did she want a finished one? So I divided everything up and I did three. I did one that was measured, one in stages, one that was complete, and then sort of gave her a high five of, here it is, it's ready. And now I'll make myself some lunch, she said. And
It's so great.
I listened to her for 16 years. I think I should do them. But anyway, so she came into the kitchen. I was not in camera shot. She took the one that I had cooked in stages and put it together and added it to the finished one. So in essence, she really didn't do any cooking at all. And then they stopped filming, and Julia, the interviewer, producer, the cameraman, and the hair and makeup lady, and me, we all sat down at her kitchen table and ate the lunch that I prepared that she, and she leaned over and said, "This is very good, dearie." And I
Wow.
said, "It should be. It's your recipe."
Of course. From the
Yeah.
best.
So just to say, I was in the kitchen from day one. And I also ran the offices for almost 16 years. But she wasn't intimidating at all. She had very high standards. But as long as you met the high standards, everything was fine. Didn't, she helped you get there.
Okay, so fair enough. She was a very fair boss.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It was like working for Grant.
I know, obviously she had a sense of humor. I remember reading through
Oh,
Dom DeLuise's cookbook, Eat This, It'll Make You Feel Better. And
right.
he said he appeared with her on David Letterman, I think, and he was so nervous that he was going to be working with Julia Child, and she sensed it, and they were cracking eggs, and he said she just started throwing the shells over her shoulder, which immediately put him at ease. And he just said, "What a
Right.
lovely and what a great sense of humor." Anything stand out in terms of, did she have a wacky sense of humor? Would she put people on?
She had an amazing comic sense of timing. She knew what to say and when to say it, but she was just very funny. She really was. And in fact, friends of mine, when I first started working with Julia, asked me if I knew about the David Letterman, the Saturday Night Live skit that by Dan Aykroyd,
Yeah.
and what did you think of it? And I had never seen it.
Wow.
And but they kept bugging me. What does she think? What does she think? So one day I went in and I said, "Julia, what do you think of the Saturday Night Live skit that Dan Aykroyd did?" And she laughed and she said, "It's very funny, don't you think?" And I said, "Well, I've never seen it, but I understand it's quite funny." So I wish we had cell phones then that took video, because Julia stood up and did Dan Aykroyd doing Julia Child. It's one I've ever seen in my life. When I actually saw the Dan Aykroyd skit, it was quite funny. Nowhere near as funny as Julia saying, "Save the liver."
So she was a good sport.
I mean, she had a really good sense of humor about it. Interesting story about that. Many years later, I was at a dinner and I was seated next to a gentleman who, as it turns out, was the person who wrote the skit. And he gave me the background behind it, which was Julia used to do cooking shows for Good Morning America. And on one of them, she cut herself so badly that they immediately broke to commercial break. And they called for an ambulance. And she insisted that she needed to finish the segment, that the viewers needed to know how to finish whatever the dish was that she was making. So they wrapped her up. She looked like she had a turkey drumstick on her hand because her thumb had been cut.
Wow.
But she carried on and finished the show and then went and got stitches. So the Saturday Night Live folks thought this was really funny, and they did a little skit that they practiced and rehearsed, and everything was fine. But Saturday Night Live was done live, and when they were doing it live, the blood spurting machine broke. and it kept spurting and spurting. And Dan started ad-libbing, and the guys in the control room were laughing so hard that they couldn't do anything to help him because they couldn't stop laughing. And
God.
went on and on and on, and then finally just died because he thought this is never going to end. So he just flopped himself down onto the table. And yeah, so they said it was just one of the funniest things that they had seen, because it was not at all how it was supposed to go.
Did they ever meet? Did she ever meet Dan Aykroyd?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Because I
and
know it's one of the
Julia
most famous.
always Julia always had a great sense of humor. There's another pretty funny story. When I first was with her, we one day she came in and she had a needle and thread, and she asked me if I could thread the needle for her, and I did without thinking about it and handed it back. And a few minutes later, it occurred to me, what the heck is she sewing? So I tottered down the hallway, and there was a room that Paul had used as his photography studio, that had a little toilet and sink in it that he used as his dark room. And above the toilet there was a Venetian blind, and one of the cloth things that holds the blind had come down. So Julia was reaching over the toilet and trying to sew this thing. And I said, when I walked in, I said, Julia, it probably would be better if we take the blind off the windowsill so you don't have to be leaning over like that to sew it. Oh, that's a good idea, she said. So we took it down. And now, if you can picture, because she was 6'2" and I'm 5'2", so I'm standing there like this, holding the blind, and she's trying to sew. And I thought, no, this is no good. But as I'm standing there doing this, I said to her, oh, I guess this is the other answer to the question. And she looked at me funny and said, what question? And I said, how do you make a Venetian blind? And she thought for a minute and she said, what's the other answer? And I said, you poke him in the eyes. And she thought it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. And she said, that's very funny. Did you make that up? And I said, no, I think that's the world's oldest joke. And so then for the whole rest of the day, she would come in to talk to me and start laughing, and she would have to leave, and I'd come back in to talk to her and start laughing. The whole day was lost. We
Oh,
just
that's
spent the whole,
great.
yeah.
And then doing I want to, because you mentioned Paul, and obviously that seemed to be a match made in heaven. I mean,
Oh, absolutely. Yep. Yep.
was I would imagine he was infirm by the time you came on the scene.
He had had open heart surgery back in the 1980s, when it used to take like 16 or 17 hours to do that
Yeah.
surgery that now takes like 4 or 5. And during that time, he had several little mini strokes, TMIs.
Oh,
And when he came out of the surgery, he had what Julia referred to as the dwindles. So he sort of seemed to be going into dementia or Alzheimer's or any of that. And that wasn't, technically, that wasn't what was wrong. But he was much older than she.
right.
And so his memory wasn't great. His logic had decreased. But he was still funny and brilliant and articulate for still many, many more years. And then finally, he was too hard to manage. And so it was made more sense to put him into a nursing care facility, because he needed constant attention, and Julia couldn't give it to him. So instead, she put him in this care facility, and she would visit him twice a day for about 2 hours each visit. So she was there 4 hours a day. And then in between that, she also hired visiting nurses to go visit him, so that he was never sitting alone doing nothing in the nursing home. And when Julia traveled, she would call him at the times that she would have been visiting him. So she would figure out what time is 11 o'clock in the morning in Boston. And no matter where she was, that's when she would call. And then she'd call again at 2 in the afternoon, his time. Um, and so, yeah, but they were lovely together. When I first started working with Julia, Paul was much more coherent. And by the end, he didn't really know what was going on. But yeah, the love between the two of them was just beautiful.
Yeah, everything I've ever read, and again, the way it has been depicted, certainly in the Julie and Julia movie, that they just seemed like that he was in awe of her.
And just so supportive and so loving, and yeah, it was amazing. Julia told me a story one point. She had breast cancer back in the days when they didn't even call it breast cancer. It was just cancer because we
Yeah.
didn't know enough about the disease. It was just cancer, and it didn't matter where it hit your body. And they would guess at how to fix it. And she had a scar that pretty much went from her collarbone down to her navel. They opened her up, and what she said was they lopped her off and they sewed her back up and sent her home. No chemo, no radiation, nothing. They just sent her home. And she was in the bathtub and sobbing. She looked down at herself and was just sobbing. And Paul came into the bathroom and said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Look at me. How can you ever love me?" And he said, "Julia, I didn't marry you for your breasts. I married you for your legs." And she said, "Stop crying and moved on. That was enough."
Right, there was. I think there's a letter to his brother where he's describing her, and it says something like, "I just can't get over those legs."
Gams, he called them. Yeah.
The her gams, yeah, yeah, yeah. I love the photos they would take of each other. That that they would do all those fun posing in the bathtub and all of that stuff. They really seemed head over heels for each other.
They were. And Paul was an amazing photographer. And he had set up the camera, so that he could take the picture of them. And there was every year they used to send out Valentine's Day cards instead of Christmas cards because they felt that that way it wasn't lost in all of this heaps of mail, that very few people would do that. So they would send out Valentine's Day cards. And one year they sent out one from inside of a bubble bath where you could just barely see the top of Julia and Paul, and there was a little heart on the card that said, "Wish you were here." And they sent it out, and Julia said that several of the relatives were just horrified that would have been a photographer to see the two of them naked in the tub, not realizing, first of all, that it was Paul who had taken the picture. But yeah, anyway.
Because now here we're out here in California, and I still want to. I'm like, does her house still exist? Is the house she grew up in still here? And then because she came back here,
Yes. So she grew up in Pasadena,
right?
and I don't think that the house is still there anymore. I'm not really sure. I actually I'm pretty sure it isn't still there because I know that we went to Pasadena for the Rose Bowl parade, and if the house had been there, she would have wanted to drive by. So, but the golf club where she used to play and was a member is still there.
Okay.
At any rate, she she lived in a condo in Montecito Shores. They bought that when she felt that she had reached success. So that was back in the 1970s. And then they put their name on a waiting list for a progressive care community called Casa Dorinda in Santa Barbara, which had independent dwellings and then assisted living and then what she referred to as the Bonker House, and I called the Ha Ha Hotel. Um, but they would periodically they would call and say, "We've got a 2-bedroom available, which is what you had wanted." And Julia would say, "No, we're not ready yet. Put us back on the bottom of the list." And then they would, occasionally get another phone call, and she kept saying no. And then after Paul died, Julia thought, you know what, maybe now's the time to make that move. So she moved into the independent dwelling part of Casa Dorinda and never moved into assisted care or the other.
And as far as her siblings go, I know I get the impression because her dad was very, very like amazingly right wing. I don't want to upset anybody here and get into a whole political thing, but I got the impression
Because I'm
that
Republican.
I feel like maybe she and her sister might have been closer, but that the father doted on her brother.
I no, I think all three of them were totally adored. Yeah,
Okay,
they, yeah,
okay.
yeah. Yeah, her sister and brother. I think all three of them were fine, and all towed the line. I mean, Julia didn't really become a Democrat until after, I think, meeting Paul. So that was, during World War II.
Right.
Um, so she was already at that point a grown up of her own. So
Right.
yeah.
Did she ever talk
By the
about
way,
the spy days? Because everybody wants to talk about that. Julia Child was a spy.
she wanted to be. She really wanted to be. She had been engaged to be married, and the wedding got called off. I'm not clear why, but I'm pretty sure he called it off because Julia was devastated. So if she had called it off, I don't think she would have been so unhappy. But she didn't know what to do with herself, and she decided that she wanted to be the great American novelist, and ended up getting a job as a marketing manager for a furniture company, W.J. Sloan in New York,
Oh yeah.
and was just miserable. So she wasn't engaged anymore, and she wasn't happy with her job, and she didn't know what to do. And her father, who was politically connected and very wealthy, managed to get, because Julia said, "Well, I want to join the OSS. I want to be a spy." And he managed to get her into the OSS, which is the Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. He got her in, but she was too tall to be a spy. I think that was one of America's biggest mistakes, because there's no way that anybody would have ever suspected Julia of being a spy. She would not have blended in. So she would have been like, too out front for them to have thought that she was a spy. But at any rate, she had top security clearance. Her bunkmate was a spy. And she met Paul, who I'm sure was a spy. He was a photographer and an artist, a painter. He knew martial arts. He was just a poet. He was so amazing. At any rate, he used to fly reconnaissance flights and then come back with the photographs and draw maps so that they knew where things were. And he met Julia on I think on a weekend furlough that a bunch of them had, and it was a tea plantation. They were out sitting on the porch at this tea plantation, and Julia met him, and um, uh, I think he was more interested in she than she in him, but they managed eventually to hook up. There were several different versions of the story of how they actually met. The one that I think probably rings the truest is that Julia's bunkmate was named Betty, and Betty was dating Paul Child. And Paul's bunkmate, George, was looking for a date. And so Paul asked Betty if they could work out a double date where he would bring George and Betty would bring Julia. And so they agreed, and the four of them met on this tea porch. And eventually George and Betty got married, and Julia and Paul got married. So they
Wow.
swapped partners.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And with Paul, is he did run into some trouble with the McCarthy period, didn't he? Was he brought in and
He was, well, because he was very democratic.
yeah.
And they were not. They accused him of being a homosexual, and that infuriated him, because that was, I think, the last thing from his mind. He was very into women, but I think that because he was so artistic, that they used that as one of their criteria for judgment. He never got. I mean, they never convicted him. They accused him, but they never convicted him. They dropped the charges somehow. But yeah, it was demoralizing for him.
Sure.
And I think at that point he was already in the diplomatic service, and he was just so frustrated with the whole thing that he ended up retiring.
And then they wound up they having been in Europe, then they went to Cambridge.
Yes. So Julia's family was extremely wealthy. Paul's family was extremely wealthy. Both of them were trust fund babies. Julia used to say that she was from a middle class family, but let's be honest. She went to college during the Depression and she owned a car when even most women didn't even have driver's licenses. So I don't think that was middle class. And also, she used to talk about how she was never ever in the kitchen until she was like in her early 40s because they had a cook. So, yeah. Um, her heritage is that they had a family that went over in the Conestoga wagons, found land and claimed it as theirs. And just like the Beverly Hillbillies, they found oil and
Oh
laughed their
wow.
way to move to Pasadena, California. Um, Paul's family owned paper mills and forests, tree forests up in Maine. And in the paper mill, they created a kind of paper that the family still owns the patent on. And that paper, paying that patent, is used by the United States government to print the US dollar.
Wow.
So, yeah, so neither one of them was hurting for cash. So, and plus, they both had government pensions. And so they were just going to go back to Cambridge, Massachusetts and live happily ever after and just,
She
enjoy
did
life.
want. She did want. Was one of this true or false? She really had wished she had had a child, right? Was that kind of a bone of contention?
No, and I'm glad you asked that question because it's quite funny. They have a mutual friend, Pat Pratt. So I'm not sure who knew Pat first, but both of them knew and confided in Pat for lots of things. Shortly after they got married, they thought that Julia was pregnant. And then it turned out that she wasn't. And Julia confided in Pat and said, I'm so glad that I'm not pregnant. Please don't tell Paul that I said that. I know how unhappy he is that I'm not. And Paul confided in Pat, thank God she's not pregnant. Don't tell Julia because I know how unhappy she is. So Pat sat the two of them down and said, neither one of you wants kids. So at one point, Paul was a teacher at a private boys' school. And he said that the thought of having adolescent children in his house was repulsive, and which is kind of funny. But the other thing is that Paul was 10 years older than Julia. She was in her 40s when they got married. And back then, women did not have first children in their 40s. They might have had a fifth or sixth child at that point, but not a first child. So the likelihood of them getting pregnant anyway was pretty slim.
Well, she had nieces and nephews, and apparently was
Yes.
fond of. I mean, did she? Didn't she?
Well,
She did.
not she was fond of them when they became little people.
Little
Um,
people.
So they had to be able to sort of carry on a conversation. And it's funny because very often when I was working with Julia, we would go to events, book signings and such, and people would want, or she'd be a graduation speaker at a culinary school or something. People would want their photograph with her, and they would come up and they would say, can I have my photograph? And she would say yes. And then all of a sudden, the next thing you knew, the spouse and the child became part of the photo, and they would hand the baby to Julia, who would kind of hold on. The picture was done. She handed the baby to me, which I snuggled and cuddled, and yeah, no, she was like, yeah. And yeah, so and she reviewed her. One of her nieces had a son who was probably, I want to say 4 or 5 when I first met him, and she would just refer to him as the boy, the boy.
The
And it
boy.
wasn't he got much older and could actually sit down and have a conversation with her that he had a name. So
Was there? I mean, being on that set, being on any set with her, and all of that food. I mean, just watching any of her shows, you gain 5 pounds. It had to have
right.
been so much fun to be surrounded by
We had a
just.
blast, but most of that food did not get eaten. And the reason is that, we were getting up we were starting work at 6 or 6:30 in the morning. Cameras would start rolling, and as each item was finished, being under on the set under the hot lights. As soon as that take was done, that food would get moved to another room where it was then photographed for the companion cookbook. So by the time that they were done with that, you didn't want to eat that food. We didn't know if it was safe or not safe or whatever. So a lot of that stuff just sort of went by the wayside. But we always had a blast on those shows. It was always great fun because Julia was fortunate enough to not have to confine herself to what I think every other television chef has to do. She did not have to budget her time. She at the beginning they were on a very tight budget, but by the end she was able to have funding that allowed her, and her whole approach was this should be honest and straightforward. If the cake that I put in the oven doesn't rise, that's the one you should see. And I should take it out and you should see it, and I should be able to say the reason this didn't rise is. Or the stew that goes in the oven, when it comes out, if it bubbled over and burned on the side of the pan, you should see that because that's going to happen to you too. And so, unlike other shows where they put one in and then they say, here's one I made earlier, or they put one in and the oven isn't even on, and 2 seconds later they're taking out one that was made earlier. The one that went in was the one that came out, was the one that was on camera. And so we filmed in segments so that, you didn't have to wait around for an hour while that thing was in the oven. We filmed something else, but that one that came out was the one that went in. And when we were filming, for example, when we did the cooking at home with Julia and Jacques, we had no idea what they were going to make. We knew today is going to be eggs, and we just let them go to town. So whatever ingredients we thought you would want to have with eggs, we had available. Some of it on the set and some of it, on the side or down in the basement where we were prepping, so that if they said, I think I need an onion with this, and Julie would say, oh, there's one over here, because we had a part of the set that wasn't on camera, and whatever they asked for, if it wasn't on the set, we just put it there and she could reach and grab it and have it. And so we never knew what they were going to do, what they were going to say, how they were going to do it until they did it. We had people furiously writing things down as they were doing it, because very often both Julia and Jacques would say, I'm putting in a tablespoon of butter, and meanwhile it was half a pound. So you wanted to make sure the recipes are, going to match to what they did rather than what they said. And yeah, so
Would they
um,
lovingly needle each other? Like they would
oh,
disagree about, I think it should be this. No, you should put in this. And they would she would sneak behind his back a little bit and he would do the same to
yeah.
her.
Well, yeah, or Julia liked to use white pepper because she didn't like specks of black in her food,
Okay.
and she liked the flavor of cracked black pepper. So if one would say to the other one, "Could you put some pepper in here, or could you put some, salt in here, or whatever?" Julie would always grab the white pepper, and Jacques would grab the black, and whichever one was going, the other one would say, "No, no, I want the other." And for 6 weeks of craziness, and then the last day of filming, after all of that time, we were doing a show, and Jacques said, I need some pepper, and Julia picked up the black pepper and said, you probably want cracked black pepper, right? And he said, white, black, doesn't matter.
That's great. And she would call him Jack. Was that the other thing,
Yeah,
that she would purposely call him Jack?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I was watching recently, and my other half will tell you this because I get such a kick out of her on the Dick Cavett show with the blowtorch.
Right.
She's scaring the bejesus out of Dick Cavett making this French onion soup for a camping trip. Which he just seems totally horrified. And again, I just love watching her because she's got turning the thing on. She's, getting the cheese all melted, and Cavett is cowering in a corner. But you could tell he's
Right.
absolutely, I think anybody who was around her must have fallen in love with her. She just had that way about her.
Saying she was infectiously passionate about what she did. Yeah. And she was funny. She knew she was funny. Yeah.
Very, very, very funny lady. I'm wondering for you, is there a particular recipe that is something of hers that what's your go-to from Julia?
Oh gosh, that's really hard because there are so many of them and they all have different memories for me. But
Sure.
I'm a chocolate person, and her chocolate mousse is brilliant. And I remember the first time that I made it was long before I worked with her, and I read the instructions and I thought, "Oh, that's just silly." So I just took followed the ingredients, but I didn't follow her method. And then many years later, I was working with her and we needed that mousse, so I made it following her method because, I'm representing Julia. What a huge difference if you follow her method. So it's good if you do it a normal moose way, but if you follow the directions she's got, holy cow, is that good? Yeah.
Wow. Okay, we're going to be making that, John, just so you know. Because I'm a chocoholic.
Okay, so there's another one called Eminence Brune, which is a wonderful, rich, dark chocolate cake. The recipe and ingredients were turned into an operetta for Jean Stapleton, who dressed up like Julia and sang. It's called Eminence Brune. It is amazing. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. And
I love Gene Stapleton. I would love to see that.
so Jean Stapleton came to Boston to perform, and they called and asked Julia if she would like to be in the audience, and Julia said yes. And then I said to Julia, "Do you want to bring an Eminence Brune and present it to her?" And Julia said, "Oh, that would be great." So I made one, and Julia brought it with her. And at the end of the show, Julia went up and presented it to Jean Stapleton, which was great fun. And then after the show, we walked across the street to the I can't remember which hotel it was, but I think it was the Ritz Carlton, I think. Anyway, we went into their lounge, ordered drinks, and then ate the cake.
That's great. I'm salivating thinking about it. Well, I'm also trying to get him to make me the beef. But tell him he's got to make me the boeuf bourguignon.
You do, but you know what? There are several different versions of it. Do the one from the French chef cookbook, not the one from Mastering.
Okay, the French chef and not the mastering. Okay, because French chef. Wait, was mastering first or French chef second?
Mastering was first.
Mastering was first.
Right. And what happened was, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, they finally managed to get it published just at the time that Paul was retiring from the diplomatic service, and they moved back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the book had just come out. It was selling, but it wasn't like going gangbusters. Paul had a former student by the name of Russ Morash who rang him up and said, "I need a favor." And Paul said, "Sure, anything for a former student. What can I do for you?" And he said, "I've just landed this new job at educational television, and I'm producing a show called I've Been Reading. And it's a half-hour live show. The presenter talks to three different authors for 10 minutes each about their books. And we are tight against budget. We had a couple of issues. And if you could convince your wife to come on the show, it means we wouldn't have to fly somebody in and put them up in the hotel and pay all of those expenses, because you guys are right here in Boston."
Right.
And Paul said, "Oh, I don't know. I'll ask her." And Julia said no, she didn't think she could talk about the show for 10 minutes, and she didn't really want the publicity. And so Paul went back to Russ and said, "I don't think we can do this." And Russ said, "Please, just as a favor for a former student, it has nothing to do with the book. It has to do with my budget. Just tell her it's not about her, it's about me, and that we can send the questions ahead of time. 10 minutes flies by. You'd be amazed how fast it goes." All of that. And so Julia reluctantly agreed to do this. So she and Paul practiced, and Julia was really nervous about it. And the morning of the day that she was supposed to go, Russ called and he said, "One of our authors has canceled. We now only have two people, not three. So you're going to have 15 minutes, not 10. Do you want to come early? Do you want me to courier over the questions? Do you want me to tell you the questions ahead of time? How would you like to handle this?" And much to everybody's surprise, Julia's response was, "Don't worry about it. It'll be fine." So got off the phone and Paul said, "What's up? You were terrified, and now all of a sudden it's not a problem." And she said, "When I woke up this morning, I realized the show is about explaining what your book is. And my book is about having the right ingredients and the right equipment to make the right food. And so she said, I'm going to bring a bunch of different whisks and I'm going to explain what each one does and what you use it for and why it's important. And then I'm going to whisk some egg whites in my copper bowl so that they can see what it does and how it works. Now, this was back in the days when we had Head and Shoulders TV shots. There were no action shots. That didn't exist. And Paul said, I don't think you can do that. And Julia said, they want me to talk about my book. My book is about ingredients and equipment and procedure, and that's what I'm going to do. And so Paul said, okay. And so he and Julia packed everything up into the car and they drove over and they did the show. And sorry, I just got a thing that says you're on low battery. So let me just, sorry about that.
No worries.
Okay.
Hopefully that worked. I don't know. Can you still see me now?
Yep.
We got you. Let's see.
Am I upside down or am I still okay?
Upside down.
Upside
You're in Australia.
New Zealand, but yes. Okay, so I'm still all right. You still can see me.
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, they went, they did the show, and they were barraged with phone calls and telegrams and telegraphs and people showing up at the station saying, "Who's this crazy lady? Get her on. We want to see more of her." And so um, Russ called up and said, "We want to do a 7-show pilot and see if we still get the same response. And if we do, we'll get funding and we'll get you a whole series." And Julia said, "Oh, I don't think I can do that." And Russ said, "Oh, you can. It'll be great. It'll be a lot of fun." And Paul said, "Absolutely, we can do it." And so they put together 7 shows, and WGBH Studios had a fire and the studios burned down. And so they went to Cambridge Public Service Electric and Gas and hired one of their studios and had guests pay 25 cents a person to sit in the audience, and they filmed the show.
Wow.
Paul designed the 3-camera shoot that is still used today for DIY shows. So it was the wide angle of everything, the close up on the presenter, and the close up on the hands.
Right.
Wow.
So that was Paul's brainchild. That was which is pretty amazing. Anyway, Julia couldn't ever remember which was her close-up camera, so they sat Paul's hat on the camera, so she would talk to the hat so that she knew which one was her close-up one. But they were on such a tight budget that if things went wrong, they had to just carry on. So if something spilled or dropped or whatever, you just carried on. And I will right now dispel the rumor. There has never, ever been her dropping a chicken on the floor. That did not happen. I've seen every single Julia Child show. I have the tapes of all of them. If you can show me a tape of her dropping chicken on the floor, then I will change that story. But I can tell you, she said she never dropped it on the floor. I never saw footage of it. Didn't happen. So anyway, the 7 shows went really well. They got funding. They ran the series. After a year of running the series, they then got funding for a second series. And Russ Moresh, who was a brilliant producer, said to Julia, "We have to do a telethon to raise money for WGBH, for public television.
Right.
And your show is so popular. Wouldn't it be funny if we did a spoof on it and showed people behind the scenes?" And so they wrote this whole crazy skit with people on the floor handing up, pans and pots and catching things and moving things. And Paul Child took a photo on the set, a great photo, which I think has now sort of made its way around
Yes.
all over the place, of a guy, I think, holding up a fish or something like that. Anyway, that was from the spoof television series. That is not how they filmed the show. That is not how things went.
Wow.
Also, I wanted to tell you that because it was filming in black and white, after they filmed the first one and they watched it, they realized that on budget, they could get away with a lot of stuff because it was black and white. So one of the things that they did was they mostly served red wine from an open bottle because it wasn't red wine at all. It was water with gravy master in it. And
Oh,
in one
wow.
of the original French chef shows, at the end, she actually toasts, "Oh, la gravy master!" And she raises the. So she wasn't. That crazy voice and that clunkiness was not drunkenness. That was Julia, and she was not drinking until the um, I think the was it Julia Child and Company or Julia Child and More Company when it started in color and they actually had proper wine. But when Julia started her shows, there were only two kinds of wine, red and white. That's what people knew.
Right.
And so here she was talking about this taboo subject of drinking. And she was saying, no, there's lots of kinds of white and lots of kinds of red. This particular variety goes with this food. That particular variety goes with that food. And so the fact that she was talking about wine and trying to explain it and matching it with foods, I guess distressed a fair number of people. And at one point, a viewer sent a letter not to Julia but to the WGBH studios, and it was complaining, and it said that horrid woman is using tablespoon after tablespoon of wine in everything. And so they sent a copy of that letter to Julia saying, how should we respond to this? And Julia's response to WGBH, not to the lady but to WGBH, Julia's response was, she must have been watching someone else. I never measure the wine with a tablespoon.
Now you get onto a very important subject which I want us to tackle, which is fact versus fiction. Just two names I wanted to throw out: Simca, who
Right.
was one of her best friends and obviously worked on that first opus.
Yes.
I put that word in quotes, and then Judith Jones, who also gave us the Diary of Anne Frank and was
Yes.
responsible for Did you get to know these people at all? I mean, Judith lived to a ripe old age.
I knew Judith Jones very well.
Okay.
Um, Simca, I spoke to on the phone, but never met in person. So Simca or Simone Beck
Simone
was
Beck.
work, was working with Louisette Berthold and another woman who I'm sorry, I don't know what her name was. Um, but the three of them were working on a cookbook of teaching French cooking to the American public. And Julia and Paul were at a cocktail party that was part of the diplomatic service thing. And Simone and Louisette were there without their American partner, and they were bemoaning the fact that they hated her, but that they had no choice because she was the only American that they knew who cooked. And Julia overheard the conversation, turned around and inserted herself in and said, "Fire that woman, hire me. You don't know me, but I'm an American and I'm a cook and I want to do this." And they opened Le École de Très Gourmand, the school of the three hearty eaters, which basically was cooking classes in Julia's apartment to recipe test for the book. And then when Paul got transferred to Norway, Julia opened a branch of the school in Norway. And when they got sent to Germany, she opened a branch of the school in Germany, and they tested the book. But Simca offered for Julia and Paul to build a house on the Beck estate, so on Simone's estate, with the understanding that the house would go back to Simca and Simca's family when Paul and Julia didn't want it anymore. So they could build it, it was theirs to use, but that when they were done, they couldn't then sell it or pass it on to anybody else. And so that is the house that was La Pichoun, where Julia used to spend about a third of each year. Or even I think maybe half the year for quite some time with Paul. By the time that I started working with Julia, she they closed up the house about a month after I started working with Julia, so I never got to go, which was really. But yeah, had it been like a year later, I would have been the one that had been there out there closing things up. But it wasn't me, so that's okay. Um, but at any rate, yeah, Julia would talk to Simca, oh, probably once a week on the phone. And she was also very funny because Simca had a cat, which I think had been Julia's cat, or I don't know. I think who knows. But anyway, they Julia would get on the phone and she would talk to the cat too.
Oh.
Meeny, meeny, meeny.
Well,
And the
there's a
cat,
great book.
cat,
There's the children's book, Manette's Feast.
yes. And that, well, then, and Julia would, say stuff, and the cat would go meow.
Yeah, for those of you
So
who are watching, yeah, it's a really sweet children's book called Manette's Feast about, and then we have another one called Julia's Cats. It's a little slim hardcover book, but I was like so thrilled when I thought she was a cat lover. I was that my little heart leapt.
yeah.
um, so okay, you mentioned a bunch of stuff that there's a new hit series that came out last year. Prior to, I mean, I was going to say there's a resurgence in Julia Child, although she's never left. When I
Right.
go back and look, Julia Child has always been a part of our lives. But there was a major motion picture based on a best-selling book called Julie and Julia, starred Meryl Streep and Amy Adams. Um, I I think that's what really fueled my interest in Julia. Full seeing, because I think Meryl, for me, and you knew Julia, so you could say this better. To me, she became Julia.
Right. Yeah,
In
no, I think so. I think so. I have a great fondness for Meryl Streep anyway. Julia was an absolute diehard fan of going to the movies. She loved it. And didn't she was not discriminate about what film she saw. She didn't care what it was. She just wanted to see a movie. So if we passed a theater, and she would say, is there time, do we have time to go see a movie? And if the answer was yes, then by golly, we saw one. So one day we went, and Julia was fascinated by how many people it took to make a movie. And also Julia was always very appreciative of um, people and their hard work. And so when we watched films long before the advent of having interesting things at the end of all the credits so that you stay for them, Julia, Julia used to watch all the credits run. And we went to see Postcards from the Edge. And at the end of the film, as the credits were rolling, and everybody was already out of the theater except Julia and me, um, there up came a credit that said executive personal assistant to Meryl Streep. And Julia said, "That's a really nice title, don't you think?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, I think you should have that title." And I
Wow.
said, "Julia, I don't think Meryl Streep knows me." and and so Julia said, "Not for Meryl, silly." But that was how I became the executive personal assistant to Julia Child, was thanks to Meryl Streep. So we
Wow.
have, but
And
we love.
you enjoyed Meryl's portrayal of her.
Yes, I think Meryl did a brilliant job. I think Meryl's an amazing actress. Yes,
And what's not to love
and
about
and
what's not
Stan
to love about Stanley Tucci?
Stanley Tucci was brilliant. He was spot on, Paul. Absolutely, right down to the ring on the finger. He was brilliant. Yeah. So that film was probably about, I want to say 95% accurate in terms of the stories of Julia, and in places where it sort of veered from reality, it wasn't such a huge thing. Although I think in that film they portrayed Julia as being distressed that she didn't have children, which was, as we've already cleared up, is not true. But there was nothing sort of glaringly awful about the portrayal of Julia. The story was told from the perspective of Julie Powell,
Right.
and Julie's image of herself was very different than what I think other people would have perceived Julie to be.
Yeah, because just the little I've seen of Julie Powell, she was not Amy Adams.
No, no, she was not kind. She just wasn't a nice person. And we first heard about her when Russ Parsons from the LA Times was going to be writing an article about the blog. And he called up Julia and he said, "Have you seen the blog? What do you think of it? There's this girl, she's cooking her way through mastering the art of French cooking. What do you think?" And Julia said, "I don't even know what a blog is," because it was a brand new thing. And so he told us how to find it. and said, take a look and I'll call you back in a couple of days and we'll set up for an interview. So we found the blog, and on the day that we found it, it was a day that Julie had purchased meat but hadn't really read the recipe. And she was blogging that um, she wished she had read the recipe because it said marinate 6 to 8 hours or even overnight. And that she hoped that the 2 hours of marination was going to be enough because she and her husband were hungry.
Oh,
And then she prepares to make the food. Now, Julia was a stickler for grammar and punctuation, and she had quite an extensive vocabulary. And Julie Powell's writing wouldn't qualify as a standard that Julia would have been considering worthy of. Um, but at any rate, it was a blog and people loved it, and that was fine. In Julie's blog, she said at the end, she finished with, this shit has no flavor. That bitch Julia doesn't know what the F she's talking about.
wow.
Okay, now Julia truly believed the adage, if you don't have something nice to say, you don't say anything at all. So when Russ called back and said, can we do an interview? Julia said, thousands of people have cooked their way through mastering the art of French cooking. This is not a new phenomena. And also, she said, I've made it my life's policy not to let people use my name and image for their financial gain. And if you do this interview with me, Julie Powell is going to make money off of using my name, and I don't want to promote that.
Got it.
And so she did not do the interview. So Russ Parsons, who is a brilliant writer, did not want to take no for an answer, and you can't blame him. So he thought there's two ways to skin a cat, or at least more than one. And he called up Judith Jones and he said, Judith, do you know about this blog? It's going to sell the book. Can I do an interview with you and Julie Powell? And Judith said, of course, especially if it's going to sell the book. Absolutely. Whatever it is, let's do it. So then Russ said, oh, do you think you can get Julia there too? So she said, I don't know. I'll see what I can find out. So she called Julia and said, do you know about this Amy Adams? And I'm sorry, do you know about this Julie Powell and this blog? And I'm going to go do this interview and it's going to sell your book and blah, blah, blah. And do you want to come join us in New York? And Julia said, have you seen the blog? And Judith said, no. Stephanie, fax that thing. So I faxed out what we had printed. And Judith said, okay, I've just got it. I'll look at it. I'll call you back. And she called back about 10 minutes later and said, I've canceled the interview. This woman can't write, and she's not a serious cook. And so, of course, in the movie, they portray Judith as a dithering old lady who can't come out in the rain for the Boeuf Bourguignon interview. But the reality is that the reason Amy Adams, I'm sorry, I keep doing that. The reason that Julie Powell couldn't get published is because she was a terrible writer. It had nothing to do with anything else. She was a bad writer. So, anyway, Doubleday decided that they wanted the rights to the blog to turn it into a book because there were thousands of people going onto this blog, and they thought, oh, here's a cash cow. So Amy Adams is
Julie
Julie
Powell.
Powell was no dummy. Sorry, she was no dummy. She said, of course, yes, I would like $1 million and you can have the rights to the blog. So they paid it, and then they
Wow.
went to publish it as a book and realized they could not publish what was there. So they hired a ghostwriter and they replaced the blog on the internet. So you cannot find the original one. And then they published the book based on the ghostwriter one, and it didn't sell. So now they have the $1 million that they paid for the rights, plus whatever they paid the ghostwriter, plus whatever it cost to make that thing disappear on the internet, which is nearly impossible to do.
Sure.
And so they had all this layout of cash, and they thought the book's not selling. Let's make a movie and we can recoup some of our cash. So they approached Julia and said, we'd like to do a movie about this whole phenomena. And Julia said, absolutely not. she cannot use my name and image for her financial gain? No. So they did not make the movie until after Julia died, and Julia's relatives did not honor Julia's request, and they took the money and ran and let the film be made. Yeah.
Oh, that's
But
disappointing.
at least the part about Julia in that film was mostly accurate.
And you know what's great?
Unlike,
I don't know if
unlike,
hold that thought, hold that thought. For anybody who's watching, you can still watch it. Someone, Nora Ephron was, and I adore Nora. She
yes,
what a
great,
great
great,
lady.
yes.
Oh, I wanted to meet her so badly, but she was asked after the fact. They said, you should have just made the movie about Julia Child. And she said, I know it's been brought to my attention, and maybe we should have just done it about Julia. Well, a fan went in, took the movie. It's still on Vimeo. I got it before they changed their rules, and I was able to download it. It's now retitled Julia Sans Julie. And it's a 58-minute movie of just, and it holds up like a movie, and it's just the scenes with Meryl and Stanley.
Brilliant.
And you can watch it on Vimeo. Yeah, they don't make any money off of it. It's just some fan said, I'm going to take it and turn it into the movie that we really all wanted, and it's great. It's
Oh,
so
that's
good.
wonderful. That is
Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah, Julia Sans Julie.
That's great. I'll look for
Now,
it.
this
Yes.
new series, which
Oh,
I was so excited when I heard they were going to do it. I thought, oh my God, if anyone deserves it, it's Julia. What a story to tell. What a great story. And we start watching it, and we watch the whole thing, and it's been renewed. I think it starts up again in a few weeks. I
yeah.
mean, brilliant actors. BB Newirth, who I adore, uh, David Hyde Pierce, wonderful, and Sarah Lancashire is brilliant in her own right. The problem here is I am nearly as not well versed in Julia Child as I am Judy Garland, but I'm watching this thing with John and saying this didn't happen.
No,
This
didn't.
did not happen. Like none of this happened. Where is
Right.
this coming from?
Right.
Shed some light.
Totally breaks my heart. Totally breaks my heart that the whole thing got done at all. Because Julia would never have wanted it to have been done. And if she was alive, it never would have been done. Um, there are so many pieces of it that are wrong. I think in terms of accuracy, they get about a 3% because they have some of the names right. Um, let's just start with logic. Julia was a smart woman. She was a sensible woman, and she loved to drive. Okay, so let's just start there. She gets to do this interview at WGBH where she's going to go on the I've Been Reading. And in the film, they have her packing up all of her stuff and walking to the WGBH studios. She would not have walked 6 miles carrying stuff, knowing that she was then going to be on camera. I mean, that's just stupid. Plus, she liked to drive and she would have driven, and Paul would have been with her. I mean, there's, that. So let's just start there. Secondly, in the 1963 is when the first Julia Child show aired. And in the show, there's a woman named Alice
Yeah.
who didn't exist. The Alice is a made up character. She happens to be a black woman. And I can tell you that if GBH had a woman, never mind black, even white, if they had a woman working there, she would not have been a TV producer. She would have been a secretary in the back room.
Right.
There's just no way. Okay. Again, just logic would tell you
Logic.
those things. Um, there's just so many pieces of that whole thing that are wrong. I
Paul.
watched.
Paul is vilified. Paul is
Yes. Oh
vilified.
yeah. And the relationship between Julia and Paul was not a loving, adoring, supportive relationship. Now, in fairness, I watched the first episode, the first episode, and then I watched 10 minutes of 10 minutes, maybe, of the last one of the last ones.
Okay.
I wasn't going to watch anymore. I was horrified by the first one, And then friends of mine said, "You're too close. Step back. Just watch it as a fiction." Okay. One of the things that Julia told me that she was most proud of, the thing that she felt was her legacy. So, really an important thing. And she did so much for American cuisine and in general, and for women in general, not just, I mean, she was here, she had a career at a time when if women were working, they were librarians, teachers, or nurses. I mean, here she was launching into a man's world. Women didn't cook professionally. And so that, anyway, I digress. She, um, her legacy, the thing that she was proudest of, was the fact that she was able to figure out how to tell Americans how to make French baguette bread in their home kitchen. She worked on it and worked on it and worked on it and perfected it and got it down. And that was the thing that she did that she was proudest of. In the television series, they show that she's too busy to work on it and that Paul and Judith Jones figure it out.
Right.
They just took away the most important thing that Julia saw of herself as a contribution to the world. Why would you watch another moment of that show?
Right.
Yeah,
Well, again, see, for me, it's like I was talking about the Judy Garland movie with Renee Zellweger. We were talking about that in the green room, so to speak. And for me, I'm like, you're hoping it's going to get better. You go, okay, there's got to be some payoff here. But again, what they did with Paul really bothered me because first of all, they have her acting like Lucy Ricardo, that she
right.
sneaks off and sends this letter and does all of this stuff behind his back. When meanwhile, he was, if anything, you want to show the true Paul because, well, first of all, he deserves it, and two, here was a guy who in the '60s was backing his wife and saying, "I gotcha. You're
That's
gonna
it.
do. You want to do this? We're gonna do
Let's
it."
do it. We're going to do it. And how about Russ Morash, who was
Oh my,
brilliant?
yeah. Oh, and they
It, and in the show, he doesn't want to even do the show.
he's belittling her. He's making fun of her. It's
And then
like,
the show itself, why they have those people on the floor is because somebody somewhere saw the picture that Paul took of that fundraiser and didn't do any research.
yeah,
That
yeah,
that I mean, it's just stupid. Why would anybody do that? That's just, I mean, logic would tell you that's not how things are done.
yeah,
You wouldn't need to research it. You'd look at it and say this is funny, but clearly that's not how this was done.
sure.
Yeah,
Put at least this is, I know Judy Dench, just who I adore.
I
She
adore
just
her. Yes,
wasn't she wonderful? Yeah, and she stepped forward and said, if you're going to do these things, at least put a disclaimer at the top of the piece that says what you're about to see is a fictionalized dramatization based on certain events, because otherwise
right.
people walk away thinking this happened.
And that's exactly it. In this series, she drops a piece of chicken on the floor. Didn't happen. All of that. And of course, people who don't know now take this for gospel, and you cannot convince them that that's not the truth. Um, Frankly, they shouldn't have called it Julia Child. They should have just called it something else and made it a story. It didn't, because Julia didn't need to have her life reinvented.
No,
Her own story is brilliant and funny and wonderful, and there's no reason to reinvent it or redo it. And yet here they are reinventing and redoing. My big question is, on this next season, the next however many shows, if
yeah,
that carries over like into the late 1980s and early 1990s, who plays me?
right. Oh, sure. Oh my God, that's right. That's right. Well, maybe it can, lawsuit. No, it'll
Could
change.
could be worth some cash, right?
Well, I listen. I did watch a panel with that Russ Marash was on, and he was saying, "I am frankly pissed off because I did not treat her that way. I loved her."
No, he didn't. Yeah,
So
it's
it's defamation of
unless
character.
there is a wonderful biography that was done by Julie Cohen and Betsy West. They were the ladies that did the RBG biography, they also did one on Julia.
Okay.
And they managed quite happily to interview a lot of people who are no longer with us that were really important in Julia's life. So they had, for example, an interview with Julia's sister, and with a bunch of people that really knew and worked with Julia. So the stories are genuine, and they use a lot of Julia footage of Julia talking about herself from interviews that Julia did over the years. So it's a lovely piece if you want to see the real Julia.
Yeah, because there was that big, beautiful documentary. Was about a year ago, about a year and a half ago that they did with
Yeah,
PBS.
it
Yeah.
was. Yeah, they waited. They really wanted it to air, and then because of COVID, they couldn't get it into movie theaters. And then I think, yeah, I'm not quite sure what happened because I'm not in the U.S., so I don't quite know what's going on there.
Also, I must say, for those watching, watch her archive interview for the Archive of Television. It's wonderful.
Oh, good.
Yeah, her archive that she gave herself. She has a beautiful. She wore it in a lot of interviews. She has a beautiful, almost an autumnal blouse on. It's red and brown and orange, and she looks lovely. And and then there's excerpts in the kitchen. I don't know if it's from when it was donated to the Smithsonian or not, but she sat down with them for about a good 3 hours, I believe, and gave a really
Yeah.
wonderful interview for the archive.
Yes.
You were with her now. You were with her till the end, weren't you?
Right. Almost 16 years. Yep.
What was the end of her life like? I get the impression that she was still sprightly, that she did have some health issues, but she never
We
lost her vim.
right. This is one of the reasons that I didn't like Julie Powell. Julia was brilliant right up until the end. In fact, we were in the middle of filming a television series, writing the companion cookbook. She was also working on a photographic memoir of her time with Paul that she had enlisted Paul's nephew, Alex Prudhomme, to work on the project as well. But in essence, Julia was doing 95% of it.
Okay.
Julia had had a knee surgery that had gone bad. And it was a knee replacement that had been put in when she was in her 70s. And when they did knee replacements back then, they didn't anticipate them needing to be used for more than 20 years. And of course, Julia at that point was 91. And so through a bunch of complications, the knee came out, and then they gave her an antibiotic that sent her into kidney and liver failure, and we got her through that. And then they put the new knee replacement in, and she had all of the physical therapy, and she was on her way back on her road to recovery, but she was still having dialysis because of the liver and kidney issues. And when you do dialysis, very often the facilities where it's done, if it's a teaching facility, will have the student nurses and student doctors and student lab people run a variety of tests because it doesn't affect the patient. They're just on the machine and it does its thing. But as the blood comes out, they can run all kinds of tests and things with it.
Right.
So anyway, the next morning after Juliet had dialysis, we got a phone call from the hospital saying she's got an infection. It's really bad and she needs to come in for antibiotics. And so I said, okay. And I said, Julia, let's go. You need to get antibiotics. She said, I'm not going back to the hospital. I mean, she had been in there for, I think, almost 6 months. And so I could understand why she said she didn't want to go back. So I said, okay. And I called them and I said, is there any way that we can just, have her get the antibiotics here where she lives? And they said, well, call the medical center. And if they can do it, we're happy to have it done. So I said, okay. So I called the medical center and they said, yes, but she has to come in here. So I said to Julia, let's go over to the medical center. And she said, no, I don't want to go there because you only come out feet first. And so she said, I don't want to do that. So then I called her doctor. And long story short, she decided that she was not going to do it that way. If they wanted to give her the antibiotics, they would have to do it for her in her apartment, or she wasn't going to do it. So the doctor came over to talk to her and he said, listen, legally we can't do that. We can put you in a wheelchair and sit you in the lobby, give you the intravenous antibiotic, and then you can get up and walk out. You don't even have to check into a room, but you got to come over to the medical center. And she said, if I do that, can you promise me that I'm going to get off dialysis? And he said, no, we can't promise that. And she said, if I do it, can you promise me that I won't get sick again? They said, no, we can't promise that either. And she said, then I'm not going to do it. And the doctor said, then you're going to die within 48 hours. And Julia looked at him and said, starting when? Which is so cool.
Oh my God.
I started to cry. He started to cry. She said, it's my time. And that was it. She refused to go. So she laid down to take a nap at about 10 o'clock in the morning with her little kitty with her. And she never woke up from the nap, and she died about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Wow. Oh, wow.
But, with her whisk in hand, I mean, she went right. She lived until she died.
And on her own terms, really on her own
Absolutely.
terms.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next day, no, 2 days later. 2 days later, I was scheduled to teach a class in Santa Monica, and they called me and said, we're guessing you don't want to teach it. And I said, no, I think I need to teach it, and I think Julia would want me to teach it. I'm coming. So I was driving to Santa Monica, which takes about an hour or so to get to. And I had talk radio on, and of course the talk radio was all about Julia and how she had just died 2 days before and what a loss it is to the country and blah blah blah. And people were calling in and saying all kinds of interesting and lovely things. And Julie Powell called and started on about how, really at the end Julia was bonkers. She didn't quite know where she was or who she was, and that's why they had never met, because she couldn't quite get her act together to go meet Julie. And I pulled off to the side of the road, and I called the radio station and I said, you need to put me on air. And they said, no, we've finished that. We're moving on to a new segment. I said, no, you're not. You're putting me on air. And I told them who I was and that I had to set them straight. And so they put me on air. And I said, first of all, Julie Powell can't write. And that's why she wasn't able to be published. And the reason that she did not get to meet Julia was because she was disrespectful, not for any other reason. And yeah, so I just I was I was horrified. But anyway,
Wow.
needless to say, I did not have very fond feelings for good old Julie.
Well, but good for you. Well, again, because we all see this movie that was Hollywoodized.
Oh yeah, and you love Amy Adams. You want her to do well, and you can't understand why Julia doesn't go over there. So,
And
and
it,
Julia would have if Julie Powell had been like Amy, Julia would have been there.
yes, I can tell you, she shops at our pavilions. If you stop her for a photo, Amy is very happy to say, "Sure, I'll take a picture with you." So that's
Wow.
the opposite of Julie Powell.
Yeah. Yeah.
But good on you. I'm so glad you did that because, again, she's not here to defend herself anymore. And
Right. Right.
just like with this new series, what do you think? What do you think Julia's legacy is? I know that's a cliche question, but what do you think her legacy is?
I think just having passion for anything. I mean, the fact that you see her really enjoying what she's doing, she loves what she's doing. And I think that people can take inspiration from that and say, you know what? If I'm not happy with what I'm doing, it's too many hours a day to be at work at a job you hate. Go follow your dream, make it work. And so I think that that's something. I mean, for me, the biggest lesson that I learned from Julia, and I learned it lots of places, but I really saw it and it was reinforced by working with Julia, was it's really nice to be important. It's a lot nicer. I mean, it's not more important to be nice.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that carries through. And yeah, I think, and knowing that every part of the meal, from growing the food to prepping the food to cleaning the food and preparing it and eating it and cleaning up afterwards, all of it is a wonderful journey that should be enjoyed. It's not drudgery. And if it is, Julia divided the world into two kinds of people: people who like to cook and people who were enthusiastic consumers. And if you didn't fall into those two categories, you didn't matter. We don't care. We don't care about those people, she said.
Would you, just knowing how you feel about it, anybody cashing in on her, but have you ever been approached to write your own book, or do you think it's something, or you wouldn't do it?
It's interesting. Right after she died, I approached several publishers and said I'd like to write a book about what it was like working with her. And when I met with them, they all wanted the dirt. And I said, there is no dirt. There's no behind the scenes. Julia was right up front. What you saw was what you get. There wasn't an on air and off air personality. There wasn't a behind the scenes anything. And that wasn't the book that I wanted to write. But I have been working on it. And I think next year I will again seek a publisher and have it be. And yeah, and the book will be called She Called Me Dearie, because she did.
Oh, wow.
Seemed to be her pet name for people she loved. I get that. That was like her pet name for people she really loved. Oh, I love that. Oh, well, if you
Yes.
do that, you got to come back on.
Oh, absolutely. No
And
problem.
I want an advanced reader's copy. I'll pay for it.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
My husband joining us.
hey, so we have
Hello.
hello. We have so many different questions. My cousin Sharon is a huge Julie Child fan, and she wanted to know about the home in Cambridge. Peter and I used to live in Salem, Massachusetts, and we're WGBH supporters.
And we worked in Boston. That's right.
Yeah, we had a dinner theater down in Columbus, next door to what used to be the Jury's Doyle.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. But she wanted to know, so you didn't have an opportunity because you started right at the tail end of closing up France, but you must have been really involved in closing up the home in Cambridge, and then ultimately that kitchen now being at the Smithsonian. What was that like?
Well, it's interesting. There was an organization called Copia, which was the American Center for Wine, Food, and the Arts in Napa, California, that was put together by a bunch of vintners, including Robert Mondavi and a bunch of other people. And they put together this museum, which also had a restaurant and a conference center and all sorts of other things, all based on wine and food and the pleasures of the table. And when they were first fundraising and developing the concept and the place, Julia said to them, make a temporary exhibit space that you can put temporary exhibits in. And when I leave my house in Cambridge, you can have the kitchen that you can then make a permanent exhibit in that space that you have set aside.
Wow.
And they said, great, wonderful idea. But they didn't do it.
Oh,
And so we didn't know that they hadn't done it. We knew that there was exhibition space. We didn't know that it wouldn't accommodate what her kitchen was or how it would go in or whatever. So at any rate, I called them when Julia said she had decided, I'm 89 or 90. No, what did I say? No, I'm 89 and I need to start thinking about my future, she said. And so she decided she was going to close up the house in Cambridge and move permanently to California. And so I called Copia and I said, Julia's going to close up the house. The kitchen is going to be yours. How do we go about doing this? What's the process? And the person that I spoke to said, oh, wonderful. We were just about to order cooking equipment because we need it. So what has she got? Because we will put it to use right away. And I said, no, 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 no. This is like an American icon. This is
right.
stuff that you need to be putting on display, not using in your demo kitchens. And they said, no, no, we can do with it what we want. And if she's leaving it to us, this is what we need right now. So this is going to be brilliant. And I said, I need to call you back. And I hung up. And I called Margaret Beaver Mondavi and I said, Margaret, help. And she said, oh my God, I don't know who you were talking to. Let me sort it out. So I said, okay. So she went to make her phone call. And I, meanwhile, called my friend Brian Maynard from KitchenAid. And I said, Brian, I think I have a very expensive request to make. I need a favor. And he said, what is it? And I said, can KitchenAid donate cooking equipment and supplies to Copia? Because they want to use Julia's cooking equipment in their kitchens instead of putting it on display. And I'm going to see if I can get it into the Smithsonian. And he said, consider it done on one condition. And I said, what's that? And he said, we want to be one of the sponsors at the Smithsonian if that's where
Wow.
it's going. And
Wow.
I said, I don't think that'll be a problem. So then I called my friend Carolyn Margolis at the Smithsonian. And I said, Carolyn, I'm not sure, but I think Julia's Kitchen is going to be available, and I think it belongs in the Smithsonian. How do we go about doing this? And I'm pretty sure she dropped the phone. I'm not quite, I couldn't swear by it, but there was a pause, and then she came back and she said, you know that really needs to go into the Museum of American History, and you know that I work at the Natural History Museum, you know, the one with the elephant. And I said, yeah. So anyway, she found out for me that the person I needed to speak with was Raina Green, and I spoke with Raina, and we made all the tentative arrangements for the kitchen to go to the Smithsonian. Meanwhile, Copia was saying no, they needed it for the equipment, and Margaret Beaver Mondavi called me back and said they really want it for the equipment. And so then I called back and I said, we're going to keep the kitchen, and I'm going to have KitchenAid contact you. You can order whatever you need. We'll make it all work. So they got new ovens and new spatulas and everything else that, you know, toasters and whatever there was that they needed. And that was fine until they heard that the kitchen was going to the Smithsonian, and they said, no, you can't do that. It was promised to us. We have it in writing. It was promised to us. So meanwhile, things went round and round, and the long and short of it was that the wall with the copper pots went to Copia, and the rest of
Oh.
the kitchen went to the Smithsonian, which worked out to be brilliant because where the copper pot wall was, they put up a lucite wall with the outlines of the pots, and it gave the viewers a brilliant view into the kitchen. Now,
Smart.
the Smithsonian exhibition, you cannot walk through. And the reason is because when they went to take the floor, they realized that the linoleum was asbestos backed. And so they couldn't take.
Oh.
So they took a photograph of the floor. So the floor in the exhibition is an actual photograph of the actual floor. And so you can't be walking on a photograph. And so that is why you cannot walk through.
You can only stand off and take a picture of it.
Right. So you can look through the lucite wall and everything
Yeah.
else. Now, P.S., because in the end, karma always comes around to bite you. Um, Copia was badly managed and went out of business. The building is now owned and run by the Culinary Institute of America with their Greystone campus. I think they run classes and winery things there. But the copper pot wall has now been reunited with the rest of the kitchen. But
Oh,
they did
wow.
not put it into place. They left it separately because where that wall was is such a nice, easy way to look into the kitchen. And if your listeners are interested and they go to the Smithsonian to look at it, it has now become part of a much larger exhibition about food and television in American history. And it makes its way all the way through to the TV network. And it's sort of this wonderful spider that you can follow about how what each one did influenced the next. And it's quite interesting. But also, just as an FYI, if you look at the refrigerator in the kitchen, my photograph is on there with Julia. And
Wow.
if you look at the telephone, speed dial number 1 says SJH. That's me.
Oh, wow.
So cool. That's
Yes.
great.
And the other thing you can't see, but I can tell you about, is that the folks from the Smithsonian were so pleased and so grateful that I had made the arrangements that they bought a coffee mug that says Stephanie, and it's inside the dishwasher in the
Oh,
in the
that's
exhibit.
great.
That's
So
fabulous.
it wasn't really mine, but it's there.
Oh,
So
immortalized at the Smithsonian. That's so great.
That's That's it. But also, when Paul used to love eating bananas, and he would take off the Chiquita banana sticker and he would stick it under the table, and those stickers are all still there under the table.
wow.
Didn't know that.
Yeah.
So watching right now is a very close friend of ours who lives in New York, Marie Wallace, actress from the TV show Dark Shadows in the 60s and 70s. And Marie, I'm mentioning this because I see you in the audience, but Marie told me this, and Peter and I have been to your home. Marie's kitchen is actually designed after Julia's kitchen, with the outline of all of the where the pot hangs and.
That is
So
true.
you guys are in theater. That is a props trick from theater. So that you hang up the revolver and it says, gun from scene one, act two, or whatever, so that at the end of the night that you have all your props and that they've come back into place. And that
Absolutely.
was
Exactly.
Paul did that because it meant that when Julia got famous and they would have people come and visit, people wanted souvenirs, and this way, before people left, they could look up and see, yep, we got all of our bras and pants. So whatever they took wasn't something from there. So yeah.
So this next question comes from Michael Thomas, and Michael lives in New Jersey, a lifelong Julia fan, and actually ties into a little bit about what we're talking about. How was Julia relative to kitchen gadgets and technology? Was she into?
She was a gadget freak. She
Oh,
wanted
really?
everything in every color, shape, and size. She loved it. And tons of people would send stuff to her, but because she didn't lend her name or image to things, she never did product endorsement. So if people would send her stuff, she would say, I like this, but you can't use that as a quote on your advertising.
Right.
Got
Um,
it.
it's also why sponsors, uh, she didn't want sponsors to she didn't want to be beholden to them. She didn't want to have to say, use your KitchenAid mixer. She loved the KitchenAid mixer. She used it, but she did not want to have to say, this is the piece of equipment that I use. So they all knew that there was going to be no product endorsement, but there was product placement. But she loved having every kind of gadget under the sun. They were all there.
She loved the microwave. She right.
Oh
She
yeah, she actually caused a fire in one once.
did
Oh,
she
wow.
really?
The newspaper came in and it was wet. It got wet because it was raining, and she put it in the microwave to see if she could dry it out. And next thing you know, smoke detectors were going. It was it was quite a scene.
Wow.
Yeah, no, she was fascinated with it, and in fact, there was a book that I can't remember. I should it's gone out of my head, but there's a book about preparing bread in half the time, where you start the process, you make it in a food processor, and then you start it in the microwave so that the proofing time gets cut way down. So you like put it on for on low for, I don't know, 30 seconds, and then you wait, and then you put it in again and again and again. And Julia didn't believe that it would really work, so we got the book, and she bought a new microwave because her microwave was too old to do what this one said that it needed to do. And she did 2 batches of bread, and then when they were ready to go into the oven, she left the kitchen so that I put them in, so that she wouldn't know which loaf was which. And when it came out, we cut them and tasted them, and sure enough, she was pleased, and then wrote them a letter and said, it really does work, and I'm impressed with this.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so she even used it for proofing her bread. Yep.
Amazing.
Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Did we have another question, John? Or we?
Yeah, actually, are a few more questions.
If Steph is okay answering them.
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So we have a message from Beth Kenningworth. Beth wants to know a little bit more about Paul and their relationship. Is it true that Paul designed something in the White House?
Oh, I I don't know. It certainly is possible. Um, but I don't know the answer to that question. He designed Julia's kitchen. He had it so that the counters were at a height for Julia, which always made me feel like I was, working up under my chin because I was so much shorter. Um, and the kitchen table was too low and the counters were too high. So very often I would stack cutting boards up on the kitchen table so that they were at the right height for me because the counters were too high. But he not only did he design the kitchen, he also painted it, and he mixed the paint himself. And
Oh,
so it was a sort of a bluish green, and depending on which direction you faced, it was a different version of the bluish green, because when he ran out, he mixed it again, but it didn't exactly match. And when they were filming the MasterChef series at Julia's, the producer said to me, "Could you please send us a drawer front so that we can make the fake island match to the paint?" And I said, "So I'm guessing you want the drawer by the sink rather than by the oven?" And he said, "Well, no, both wouldn't matter because they're both going to be on set." And I said, "Well, they're two different colors."
Oh, how funny.
Yeah. So also Julia had a black refrigerator that was a Westinghouse refrigerator. I'm not sure how old it is or was, but when you opened the refrigerator door, inside the refrigerator on the bottom right hand side was the freezer. It was inside the door of the refrigerator. So it must have
Oh,
been one of the original refrigerator freezers.
okay.
And she had taken out one of those repair or replace warranties. And the repairman came, and he must have been at least in his 70s. I'm not very good at guessing age, but he might have even been in his early 80s. He certainly was definitely well into his 70s. And he said, "Mrs. Child, I'm really sorry. We have been trying to fix this for you for years. They don't make these parts anymore. We're just going to have to replace the refrigerator." And she said, "I don't want to replace the refrigerator." She said, "Young man," he was, already so old. "He's, young man," she said, "this says lasts a lifetime and I'm still living." Needless to say, we got a black KitchenAid refrigerator freezer that is now in the Smithsonian.
Oh, wow.
Amazing.
Tara Blevins wants to know. Clearly, there was a lot of love between Jacques Pepin and Julia. Did she have some other favorites that she worked with? I remember Paul Prudhomme was one of my favorites watching them together.
Yes, she had a lot of fun with everybody. She really did. She anybody that had fun and a good sense of humor and liked being in the kitchen, she was great with. But I think her relationship with Jacques was almost like he was her son, and it was lovely. It was really lovely. But she also liked Jasper White. I'm not sure, I'm not. He was a local Boston chef. I don't know. How well known he would be to the general population. I mean, he's amazing chef. Um, uh, Certainly, Sarah Moulton was one of her
L-
good buddies that she liked to hang with.
Love Sarah.
Um, Ann Willen, um, yeah, Gordon Hammersley. But yeah, as I said, she enjoyed. She had fun wherever Julie went. You knew you were going to have a good time.
And did she? This is I'm interfering here.
It's okay.
Did she or didn't she like Italian food?
She did. She didn't like Mexican food. Now, here's an interesting story. Good Morning America was coming to do a piece with her when she was in California. And they said, "We want to take you to your favorite restaurant." And she said, "Santa Barbara's too small. I don't have a favorite restaurant. There's lots of restaurants here. I like all of them. Um, so I don't want to film at a restaurant because if we film at one, it's going to make other people unhappy." And they said, "What if we go to a restaurant you've never been to?" And she said, "Fine." So they went to a place called Super Rica Taqueria,
Oh
which is a
gosh.
little Mexican restaurant in the middle of Santa Barbara. And they filmed there, and everybody decided that that was Julia's favorite restaurant. And she said people would come to visit her, family and friends and whatever would come to visit, and they'd say, "Oh, we got to go to the," and she said to me, "I always make sure I eat before I go because I don't like that food."
And she imparted something to me that I got from you, which was, don't I say this all the time, John? If they can make a good burger,
Yeah.
Yes.
then they probably can do almost anything else. Because when we go to a
Right.
restaurant, I will try a burger first. Because I
Right.
heard you say that about Julia, that was her taste test. Let's try the
Right.
burger.
That's it. Yes. And it's interesting because, Julia had such a reputation, and we would go into a restaurant and she'd order a burger and they would be so disappointed. It's like, "Oh, she's only ordering the burger." But, that's that was her go-to. We used to go to In-N-Out Burger and get the burger and the chips and then go sit on the beach and eat them.
Love In and
We
Out.
also, she loved going to Costco She
Really?
liked like the number 10 sized cans, and all of this stuff was always amusing to her. And also, very often we could get copies of her cookbooks there cheaper than we could get from the publisher. A lot of people are under the false impression that authors get their books for free. They don't, they pay for them. And so we would go to Costco and buy Julia's books so that she would have them to donate to charity auctions and things.
Oh wow.
And but one time we went to Costco and we had worked our way through, and she said, "You want to get a hot dog and then we can go to the movies?" Because the movie theater was across the parking lot. And I said, "Okay, great." And we walked outside and there was this big queue for the food. So I said, "Julia, you sit at the table and I'll go get our hot dogs." And when she sat, one of the Costco managers came over to me and he said, "Is that Julia?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "What's happening?" And I said, "Well, I'm in line to get hot dogs." And he said, what does she want?" And I said, "We want we want hot dogs, and we want and a Coke." And he said, "Oh, go sit down." And he brought it to us. So we got table service at Costco. Ha ha.
Wow.
That's great.
Hey, Steph, let's talk a little bit more about you. I think your master's is one of the coolest things ever. You were the
Oh, thank you.
first you were the first graduate of a really unique program, one of the first of its kind.
Right. So Julia was interested in turning cooking from manual labor into a profession. And the only way that you can do that is through education. So she started having all of these conference meetings with people in the Boston area, um, uh, restaurant people and other food and wine people and educators, to say, how do we get a master's program going to promote food? And so all of these meetings were happening with the folks from Boston University and all these mucky mucks from Boston area in Julia's kitchen. And of course, I was working there, so I was hearing all these conversations and sometimes part of them. And I thought, I'm going to start taking these classes now before this even becomes something, so that I'm ahead of the game, because I could only take one class a semester. I was working and traveling and doing all of that.
Sure.
And so by the time that the master's program was officially on offer at Boston University, I think I only needed another 3 classes and my thesis to complete the program. So, Masters of Gastronomy is everything about food except cooking. So, you're looking at the politics, and you're looking at the nutrition, and you're looking at the economic impact, and the social impact, and looking at food writing and all of these different aspects of food. And so by the time that as I said, by the time that it became a proper program, I was already well and truly almost done with it. So when I graduated, I was valedictorian and last in my class.
Oh.
And we always have 100% participation in our reunions. um, but my thesis was on the social, political, and economic implications of cookbooks written for children in the United States. And it was fascinating to me to look at how you could look at a child's cookbook and see what was going on written between the lines. So for example, when the economy was really poor, you had books that said, get leftovers from the kitchen and here's how we can make a stew, or something of that sort. And when the economy was really good, you had things like, let's make this little dolly salad with the lettuce skirt and the carrot stick legs and 2 raisins for eyes, not telling you what to do with the rest of the box of raisins, or the that sort of. So you could sort of see, or you had uh, equipment specific things going on. Take your pasta maker and cut the pasta dough, as opposed to use a rolling pin and then cut this with a knife, sort of thing.
Sure.
Um, And also in the early 1900s, you had the foreign food section, and it would say things like, "Put a checkered tablecloth on the table, and put a drippy candle, and then put some ketchup onto this cooked spaghetti, and there's your Italian meal." And then by the 1980s, there weren't foreign food sections in new cookbooks. The cookbooks had international cuisine all through. So you would have, under the breakfast section, you'd have burritos for brunch, kind of thing. It had already become a melting pot where you could see that all sorts of ethnic foods were incorporated into what the cookbook was about.
Wow.
So yeah, that sort of answer your question. I don't know. I kind of rambled
Yeah.
on.
No,
No,
you
not at
totally.
all.
Fascinating.
No, not
Now,
at all.
is your degree from Boston University?
Yes. My
Uh,
my master's degree is from Boston University. I went to Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It's a big pre-med, pre-law college. I majored in theater, English, and anthropology
wow.
because although I have lots of friends who are doctors and lots of friends who are lawyers, I really wanted to pursue a different kind of tort.
Oh,
And so
God.
I knew that if I majored in theater and English and anthropology, I was not going to be able to get a job, and I couldn't. And then off I went to culinary school because I wanted to go to culinary school right out of high school, and I got talked out of it. I was told I was too smart, that women didn't cook professionally, and besides,
Wow.
it was manual labor, it wasn't a proper job, and that I should, not pursue that wasn't something I should be doing. And the interesting thing is that the job that I currently have, I know it didn't exist. I mean, nobody, if you had said to somebody, "This is what I want to do," they would have just laughed and said that, "What are you, crazy?" But here I am now. I'm teaching hands-on cooking classes on board a cruise line, and absolutely loving it. But yeah, I mean, that totally didn't exist. Nobody would have even dreamed that people would want to do that.
Now, by the way, Boston University is near and dear to both Peter and my heart. Um,
We work with the Boston University Alzheimer's Disease Center, and
Ah, okay.
in memory of my grandma. We lost her to Alzheimer's, so it's something that's very close to our heart.
and we're
Oh, and it's a nasty, nasty disease.
Awful.
Yeah.
It's the word to be robbed of your memory.
and we're
Wait,
we're proud members of the 1839 Society too.
Okay.
and then you mentioned Lancaster, which was almost every family vacation. I
Yeah.
love Lancaster County.
Yes, it is a lovely place.
It's
Although
it's
it's changed, it has changed hugely because when I was there, there were all these, farms and paddocks, and I went there about 3 years ago, and it's a lot of condominiums and
it's
restaurants.
it's true, but
Yeah.
there's actually a lot of pretty good food.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And had all of those restaurants been there when I was a student, I know that I would have worked there instead of at Dunkin' Donuts.
All right. We asked this of all of our guests. What was COVID like for you personally and professionally?
um, well, professionally, the cruise lines didn't sail, so I was pretty much out of work. The timing of it was such that I had we had docked in Miami, and I got off the ship to go spend a 2-week vacation with my parents, and then I was scheduled to get back on the ship and continue sailing. So I got off the ship, and then COVID hit, so I did not get back on the ship because clearly there was no ship to get back onto. And living in New Zealand, they shut the borders. I couldn't come home.
Oh wow.
So I got stuck in Florida, which is like one of my least favorite places in the whole wide world, in spite of the fact that my parents were living down there. They had only just, as snowbirds, had finally just purchased down there and had given up their place up in New Jersey. Um, it meant that I spent an entire year with my parents, which turned out to be an absolute blessing
Oh wow.
because mom was unwell, and I spent every single day with her until she passed.
Hmm.
And dad was at that point at the beginning of Alzheimer's. And so it was nice to spend time with him and know that, we made some really nice memories. And yeah, so when lots of people were saying how unhappy they were, how bored they were, how they had nothing to do, I was extremely jealous because there I was putting caregivers into place and watching my parents get more and more unwell. Um, Rather than writing my book or doing all of those recipe testing and things that you'd want to do, that wasn't what was happening for me. But I am so grateful that it happened when it did, and that I spent the time that I spent. So that worked out. Things happen for a reason,
Yeah.
and so yeah, so that it was. Yeah, it was a sad but happy time for me personally, and professionally, it did nothing.
Now, can people go on your cruises and take your classes?
Absolutely, yeah. It's Oceania Cruise Line. We are certainly online. Our parent company is Norwegian Cruise Lines,
Okay.
which has like the 4 and 6,000 passenger ships. The one that I'm on has 1,200 passengers. So we have two ships. Actually, we will now have three ships that have the hands-on culinary center. So we have Marina, Riviera, and now Vista is launching next week, I think. And so those are the ships that have the hands on culinary centers. So we teach the hands on classes. And then very often when we go into port, we'll lead an excursion. So, for example, I was just in the Caribbean. So we went to Belize and we went to the spice farm. We saw
Wow.
peppercorns growing on the tree, and we saw nutmeg, and we saw vanilla beans, and all of that. And we would gather up spices and then bring them back to the ship and cook with them. In San Juan, we went to an amazing hydroponic farm where the stuff not only looked beautiful, but they have actually figured out how to make it taste beautiful as well. And the guests would gather up ingredients, and then we would go back to the ship, and I would show them how to cook with that so that they didn't ruin these beautiful, lovely flavors
Wow.
of the delicate and lovely greens and microgreens. Yeah, so in Italy, we'll go and see olives being pressed into oil, or we go out and we see salt being mined off the sea flats, so that you've got your sea salt being harvested and things like that. So when we went to Russia, we would go for a caviar tasting, that sort of thing. So yes, and they're all great fun. The other branch of our cruise line is Regent, which has Explorer and Splendor, and those two ships also have the culinary center. So any of those five ships now, you can book a cruise and sign up for a class.
How cool.
Just out of curiosity, getting because a big theater nerd in me, I've always wondered, again, because I was so impressed with Meryl Streep, what do you think if they ever attempted to do a theatrical? I mean, a stage production, either a slice of life or something that was based on Julia. Do you think it could work?
I do, and I think I mentioned earlier that we had Gene Stapleton did a brilliant job of being Julia singing that little operetta.
That kind of,
Uh,
yeah. So I
yeah,
wondered. I said a stage like a straight play, but something that could, whether it's a one woman show or something that, because I think in the right hands, if they had consultants like you,
yeah,
and Russ, the people that we really knew her, I think it could be a really great theatrical experience to have Julia live on stage.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because, for example, when they were doing the chicken show for the French chef, it was Julia's idea to line up all of those chickens, and say it's Mrs. Rooster and Mrs. And the capon. That was Julia's brilliance, and I would imagine that a play showing her coming up with these things would have been it's a great idea.
Yeah, yeah. I think it could work. A theatrical production about Julia Child, I think would be amazing. It's a holiday weekend. A lot of people are going to be cooking Passover, Easter. What do you think Julia's advice to them would be?
Oh, have fun. Doesn't matter what you make. It was interesting. At one point, I was dating a guy who was Greek Orthodox, and we were at the very beginning of our relationship. And Julia said to me, "Are you going to his place for Easter or your place for Passover?" And I said, I think he's going to his place for Easter and I'm going to mine for Passover. And Julia said, why? And I said, because we can't, they're both on the same day and we can't really, you can't do both. And Julia said, so just have them to your place. And I said, yeah, and what do I serve? She said, do a ham, but put kosher salt on it.
Great. Funny lady.
She was very funny.
Funny lady. Well, guys, now we got to look forward to. We're going to hold Steph to this. She called me dearie. That's the book. So you got to come back for that. We all want to read the book. Is there a website? Do you have a website, or is there any place anyone can? No website.
No, I'm on Facebook, but it's not terribly exciting.
Okay. But YouTube videos, right?
I don't know. I might be.
Okay. All right.
You can Google me.
Google Stephanie Hersh, and we're gonna look.
Is that an adjective? I'm Googleable.
I'm Google. Well, we just made it one.
There you go.
We just made it one. And I wanted to do first of all, Stephanie, thank you so much for being a guest.
Oh, my pleasure.
I appreciate it. This is one of the, I'm seriously, guys, this is one of the most fun chats we've had in a long time with a guest. It was our pleasure. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I wanted to do this at the top of the show. We couldn't, but we can do it now. That signature phrase that she ended all of her shows with on the count of 3, if we can do it together in our best Julias. Wait, John wants to do it too. Get in here, John. Get on camera. It would not be a Julia Child show without this. Let's see if we get him in here. Where is he? He coming in?
Yeah.
So, on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Bon appetit! Here's to you, Miss Child. We love you.